I never expected this trip to change me. It was supposed to be a short getaway, just some time alone to clear my mind. My relationship wasn't bad, but something felt missing. My spouse and I had been together for years, and while we loved each other, the spark had dulled. Conversations were routine, touches felt mechanical, and we spent more time scrolling on our phones than looking at each other. It wasn't dramatic, just a slow, quiet fading. Then I met him. He wasn't anyone special at first glance. Just another traveler, someone who happened to be in the same group as me. But he had this energy, casual, confident, like nothing ever weighed him down. He laughed easily, made jokes with the locals, and never seemed in a hurry. We struck up a conversation by accident, standing in line at a cafe, and before I knew it, we had spent an hour talking like old friends. It wasn't flirting, not at first. It was just easy. He asked about my life, my interests, my dreams, the kind of things my spouse used to ask about before life got in the way. I found myself smiling more around him, looking forward to our next conversation. One night, after a long day of exploring, we ended up at the same bar. I wasn't planning to stay long, but he convinced me to sit for one drink. One turned into two, and soon we were deep in conversation, sharing stories about childhood, regrets, and the things we never said out loud to anyone else. He listened, not just nodded along but actually listened. Then he said something that made my stomach tighten. "You know, I don't think I've ever met someone like you." It was a simple sentence, but the way he said it made me feel seen. Not as a spouse or a coworker or a responsible adult, but as me. Person. A woman who once had dreams, who used to be spontaneous, who used to believe in magic. I felt the shift in the air. A tension neither of us acknowledged but both understood. My mind screamed at me to be careful, but my heart whispered, just enjoy this moment. It's harmless. Or at least, that's what I told myself. By the time I left, it was late. The streets were quiet, the world wrapped in a soft, warm silence. He walked me back to my hotel, stopping just outside the entrance. "Good night," he said, his voice lower, softer than before. I hesitated, feeling something unfamiliar stir in me. But then I nodded, turning away before I could do something reckless. As I lay in bed that night, I tried to ignore the way my heart raced. I tried to convince myself that nothing had happened, that I was still the same person I was before this trip. But deep down I knew something had started, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to stop it. The next day I told myself to create some distance. It wasn't like I had done anything wrong, but something about last night lingered. I went about my day alone, trying to focus on the beauty of the trip, the sights, the culture, anything to clear my head. But then, as if the universe had other plans, I ran into him again. He grinned like we were old friends. "Thought you were avoiding me for a second." I laughed it off, but I knew he wasn't entirely wrong. Still, I didn't walk away. Instead, we fell into an easy rhythm again, like yesterday had never ended. We explored together, stopping at small shops, tasting street food, and swapping stories. He had a way of making everything feel lighter. I didn't have to think about responsibilities, about what waited for me back home. At one point, as we walked through a quiet alleyway lined with lanterns, he brushed his hand against mine. Could have been accidental, but I felt it. The warmth, the hesitation. Neither of us acknowledged it, but my heart was pounding. Later that evening, a group from the trip planned to watch the sunset from a hilltop. I hadn't planned on going, but when he asked, I said yes before I could think. The view was breathtaking, the sky a swirl of oranges and pinks, the ocean stretching endlessly below. He stood close, too close. "You ever just feel like you're exactly where you're supposed to be?" I turned to look at him, and in that moment, everything felt still. I knew this was dangerous. I knew I should step back. But I didn't. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't think I've felt that in a long time." He held my gaze, and for the first time in years I felt truly seen. Not as someone's spouse, not as a responsible adult checking off boxes in life, but as a person. As a woman who once dreamed of something more. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a cool breeze wrapped around us, and without thinking I shivered. He noticed. Without a word, he draped his jacket over my shoulders, his hands lingering for just a second too long. "Better?" he asked. I nodded, but my throat felt tight. The walk back was quiet, the air between us thick with something neither of us wanted to say out loud. When we reached my hotel, he didn't walk away immediately. "I like talking to you," he said. I swallowed hard. "Me too." He hesitated, searching my face like he was looking for an answer, for permission, and maybe, in some unspoken way, I gave it. Then he smiled. Slow, knowing smile. "Good night," he murmured before walking away. I stood there for a long time after he left, the weight of the moment settling deep in my chest. I knew I was playing with fire, but for the first time in a long time I wasn't sure I wanted to put it out. I told myself I wouldn't see him again, that this was just a moment, a fleeting connection that meant nothing. But when I woke up the next morning, the first thing I thought about was him. The day passed in a blur. I tried to focus on the trip, to remind myself why I was here. But every time I looked around, I caught myself searching for him. And when I finally saw him, leaning casually against a railing, watching the ocean, I knew I had already lost this battle. He looked up and smiled like he had been waiting for me. "Hey, stranger." I didn't respond right away. I should have walked away. Instead, I walked closer. We spent the rest of the afternoon together, but something was different now. The glances lingered a little longer. The conversations felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. Every time he reached for something near me, my drink, my phone, I felt the heat of his skin. Every time he laughed, I caught myself watching his lips. I knew where this was heading, and I did nothing to stop it. That night, when he invited me to join him for a drink at a quiet rooftop bar, I said yes without hesitation. The city lights stretched out around us, the world below feeling distant, unreal. We talked for hours, the lines between right and wrong blurring with every sip of wine, with every brush of his fingers against mine. At some point I stopped thinking about consequences. When he reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear, I didn't pull away. When his hand rested lightly on my thigh, I didn't move it. "I don't want to make things complicated for you," he said quietly. "It's already complicated," I whispered back. He leaned in, close enough that I could feel his breath against my skin. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "You can tell me to stop," he murmured. "Just say the word." I opened my mouth, but nothing came out, because I didn't want him to stop. The first kiss was soft, hesitant, like he was giving me one last chance to change my mind. But I didn't. I leaned into it, letting the weight of everything I had been holding back crash over me. His hands traced my arms, my back, pulling me closer. I melted into him, losing myself in the warmth, in the feeling of being wanted, truly wanted. By the time we broke apart, I was breathless. He searched my face, waiting for regret to set in. But it didn't. I took his hand, leading him away without a word. That night I let go of everything. Guilt, hesitation, reason. I let myself feel. And when I woke up in his arms the next morning, I knew there was no going back. The morning light streamed through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room. For a few blissful seconds I forgot everything. Forgot where I was, what I had done. I only felt the warmth of his body beside me, the steady rhythm of his breathing. Then reality hit. I sat up slowly, careful not to wake him. My heart pounded as I took in the scattered clothes, the unmistakable intimacy that filled the air. My mind raced, searching for a way to justify this, to make it something less than what it was. But there was no excuse. No way to rewrite what had happened. I had crossed a line I could never uncross. Slipping out of bed, I dressed in silence, my hands trembling as I buttoned my shirt. I told myself I had to leave before he woke up, before I had to face the weight of my actions. But as I reached for the door, his voice stopped me. "You don't have to go." I turned to find him watching me. His expression unreadable. There was no regret in his eyes, no guilt, just quiet understanding. "I do," I whispered. He exhaled slowly, nodding. I won't ask you to stay. But I won't pretend this didn't mean something. I wanted to argue, to tell him this was a mistake. But the truth sat heavy in my chest. Had meant something. And that was the problem. I left without another word. The walk back to my hotel felt endless, every step dragging me closer to a reality I wasn't ready to face. My phone buzzed. Messages from my spouse, asking how my trip was going, saying they missed me. Guilt crashed over me in waves. How could I go home and pretend nothing had happened? How could I look them in the eye and act like I was the same person who left? For hours I sat in my room, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment. I had always believed infidelity was a choice made by selfish people, people who didn't value what they had. But now I wasn't so sure. I hadn't gone looking for this. I hadn't planned to betray my vows. And yet I had. The thought of confessing flickered in my mind, but the consequences were too terrifying to face. Would I destroy everything over one night? Would the truth make anything better? Or would it only shift the burden onto someone who didn't deserve it? By the time my flight home boarded, I had made my decision. I would bury this, lock it away in a part of me that no one would ever see. But as I sat on the plane, staring out the window, I knew the truth. I could lie to my spouse. I could lie to everyone. But I could never lie to myself. I wasn't the same person anymore. And I never would be again.